I hate to be one of those content creators with a YouTube account full of Guild Wars videos, making a video about if you should play Guild Wars 2 in X, Y, or Z year. It's almost a meme at how routine these videos are, considering the vast majority of people who watch them already play Guild Wars 2. But, anyways, here we are. So, before I share my thoughts on the current state of the game, let's take a walk down memory lane and see where we have come over the course of the last decade. Fair warning, if you are not a Guild Wars 2 player looking to play or are spoiler adverse, I will not be censoring myself for this recap of events. This video isn't necessarily going to be a story recap or anything, but there will be mention of some of the content that got released at various points in time. So if you're an ex-player, this video might be great to see what has changed since you last played. And I'd love if you stick around, but I'll leave that decision up to you. Guild Wars 2 was released in the fourth quarter of 2012 with pretty moderate success. The game was fun. The combat system was largely the same as it is now, with the exception being some classes had more animation locks, and some still do today. Core classes were largely the same, with some changes to elite skills. Guardian had its tomes removed. For the most part, most of what was taken away has been repackaged and re-implemented into the game. The core game was largely a work in progress, with some systems being revamped entirely. The new player experience seems to have largely been reworked twice, if not 3 times, making leveling experience better than it was on launch. The zones are largely the same as they were on launch, except Kessex Hills being the main casualty, which was due to a botched overselling of Season 1 Living World. ArenaNet initially did not believe in the expansion model, and they wanted a world that evolved over time where content was introduced and then phased out as the new story happened. Ultimately, this was an unsustainable development cycle where they only had 2 releases that were really worth mentioning, which was the Tower of Nightmares and the Battle for Lions arc, where they destroyed Kessex Hills and it is now in its current state, and then they also destroyed Lions Arch, which they ended up revamping into the Disneyland version that it is now. The current re-release of this content leaves a lot to be desired, and it's really a shadow of the events that were in live. The Battle for Lions Arc event of today is not nearly as satisfying as the one that was released back then. There were a couple of other things that were removed, like the third path of Twilight Arbor, which now is the home of the Aether Path, the Twisted Marionette, the Super Adventure Box, Winter's Day Halloween events. They were all taking place and they were largely the same as present day as they were in 2012. The only real thing that happened from this period was the abandonment of the style of Living World releases, the abandonment of dungeons as an endgame content type, the introduction of Fractals of the Mist during their content patch to the Lost Shores, and then the expansion of Fractals in the Fractured release nearly a year later, which served to add back some of the content that was wiped away from Living World Season 1 nearly a decade before its re-release after the launch of End of Dragons. They abandoned monthly achievements and at some point installed the now legacy daily login reward system, which was then replaced by the Wizard's Vault, but we'll get more into the Wizard's Vault later. Fractals were introduced into the game a few months after initial launch, and they consisted of 3 connecting islands that you got at random, where you would roll a fractal level and you would get a random one. Once that was complete, you would automatically port to the next, and then the last one where you would get your rewards. This setup was intended to be an expandable, scalable dungeon system that replaced the conventional dungeons of the time, and frankly, it kind of worked. The system was kind of scuffed due to server stability and the stability of internet by most players at the time. If you DC'd before completing all 3, you were screwed and you couldn't rejoin your party and you had to redo the other fractals to get your reward. Eventually, this was replaced by the individual island system that we have now with a different reward structure. You needed to complete 4 fractals at that tier to get the rewards, which led to players rolling Swampland for the old Bloomhunger spawn, which was just a boss. It was random. You would either get Mossman or you would get Bloom Hunger, and then you would just farm him 4 times to get rewards, which then was replaced by the system that we have now that is more consistent. Only recently have ArenaNet stated publicly that Fractal releases with challenge modes are a continuing content type that we will continue to get expansions on over the upcoming years. The addition of Fractals was largely a mystery after the last rewards rework, and the confirmation recently that they are continuing to develop Fractals is a good thing for most players. Living World Season 2 was released in July of 2014, and this was the first iteration of Living World where the story steps and the content around it were a permanent addition to the game. At this time of the story steps were challenging enough, with special achievements requiring some amount of skill or finesse to accomplish. This season had some of the most rewarding boss fights in the story mode content with dynamic arenas and so on. It showed the abandonment of the side-by-side way of storytelling that the core game had, which was a relief for most players. This release had 2 additions, being Dry Top, which was split into 3 releases over a few months, and then finally ending on the Silver Wastes, which was a playable map, and the Reba farm was born. Something that has been going on essentially 24/7 since November of 2014. During this time, Lion's Arch was completely destroyed, and it was eventually restored to what we have currently in June of 2015, nearly a year after the first episode of Season 2. Living World Season 2 ends with the announcement of Heart of Thorns as an expansion in July of 2015, and that was followed by a 10-month drought until the release of Heart of Thorns in October of 2015. A side note is that there was a complete trait rework to make room for elite specializations, and that trait rework has largely stayed the same. There was some iteration where you would actually go and hunt your skills down by completing events, but that system was largely unpopular, and it was removed shortly after it was implemented. Heart of Thorns released in October of 2015, and there were some minor patches and a completely scuffed beta event for Heart of Thorns where you got an item in your inventory that like teleported you to the Silver Waste or something, and it was a mess. But Heart of Thorns was what many players consider a golden era for Guild Wars 2. It had largely reworked most of the systems that were problematic, introduced elite specializations, which gave all of the classes a fun, unique new playstyle. Specs like the Druid, the Chronomancer, and the Tempest dominated the endgame meta, with the Tempest being one of the only classes that could hit like 30k DPS, which was insanely sweaty rotation, and it was crazy how much we had to do to actually get those numbers. The first of the 3 raid wings were introduced as a new type of storytelling, which remains some of the best storytelling Guild Wars 2 has currently, and everything seemed to be going pretty well. The addition of the 4 maps with lucrative, repeatable metas, gliding with good verticality, and a nice sweet spot of difficulty were a winning combination for this expansion. Let's not get too rose-colored with those glasses. ArenaNet promised a Generation 2 of Legendaries, which they did deliver eventually. The only 3 that were released with Heart of Thorns were Hope, Nevermore, and Astralaria, which did have a good storytelling collection and achievements that made them feel unique and exciting. In July of 2016, they started what was considered to be the best iteration of Living World up to this point, surprising the player base with a new map every single content drop, with a unique currency, new ways of getting ascended items, and so on, pushing the overarching story from map to map. Living World Season 3 was used as a prep for the next expansion, much like Season 2 did for Heart of Thorns, while also tying up loose ends for Heart of Thorns. Bloodstone Fen, Ember Bay, Bitterfrost Frontier, Lake Doric, Draconis Mons, and Siren's Landing were all added, along with various legendaries for each of the releases and legendary raid armor. This was the type of content style that became the standard players expected from Living World seasons, which took a ton of development time, from introduction of unique visual assets to entirely new maps. And while it was sustained for a short period, it couldn't go on forever. Path of Fire released in September of 2017, and though the new mount system, the Hidden Griffin, often and other aspects of the game were great, the maps were pretty meh. They were big, they were used to help showcase the use of mounts, but they were largely desolate, with the meta events being okay at best and completely uncompletable at worst. Some events like Serpent's Ire and Domain of Vabi were almost never completed and need a significant amount of players to even attempt. Not to mention, there weren't any real unique rewards like the way we had amalgamated gemstones in Heart of Thorns. The specializations that were added to this expansion were largely responsible for the power creep in the game that we see today. At launch, most of them were just completely bad, but because they were adjusted correctly, the skills were now completely overloaded. Getting free utility, having boon access, reflex, and so on with no trade-offs. After the balance updates, the era of Firebrand, Renegade, and Scourges dominating most metas was born and carried on for the next 2 years while Living Story was being released. So unlike other releases, the end of Path of Fire actually gave us a setup for Living World Season 4, and it was largely like Season 3, with a new map every single time, new gear, the addition of a legendary, which here we are in November of 2016, still receiving the legendaries promised in Heart of Thorns. We wouldn't get the full complete set until January of 2019 with the addition of Ferris, so nearly 2 years after the updates to get the full set of Gen 2 legendaries. They also added Vision and Coalescence during this time, and the additions of Wings 5, 6, and 7, which are considered the Path of Fire raid wings, ending the update cycle with the addition of Ascended Food in August of 2019. The biggest additions were the inclusion of the Sky Scale and Roller Beetle as a mount, and prior to those updates, the mounts were exclusively tied behind expansions. So seeing them added for free in such a high quality was really a shock, and some of the community really criticized the lack of marketing with features like this, considering WoW basically took the Sky Scale and made the Dragonflight expansion off of it. At this point, we didn't get a setup from Living World Season 4 on what direction we were going with the story. Were we going to get another X-Pack? Following the same idea from Guild Wars 1, we really only had Eye of the North or Cantha to even go to. So unless we were going to do something completely new, then we had no clue where we were going next. They then announced the Icebrood Saga in Q4 of 2019, and it was sold similarly to Season 1, that it was going to be expansion level content. They were abandoning the expansion cycle, basically revamp what they were going to be releasing. People started asking about elite specializations, something that became a staple in what was considered an expansion level content, to the response of, we are going to add gameplay features, so don't worry about it. Needless to say, it turned out that the gameplay features were a set of masteries with a couple of special action key interactions and so on. The maps today are okay, and the first 4 episodes of IBS work out pretty nicely. They abandoned raids at this point for boss only encounters they call strike missions. If you are expecting raids and going into IBS strikes, it's like a slap to the face for the in-game community. Easy is an understatement. However, these strike missions are lucrative and they still get run today. A final note on the Icebrood Saga: when you are actually going through the updates one by one, they felt really underwhelming. In its current state as a complete package, it does feel a lot better. A side note on COVID. So COVID had happened right around the time IBS was getting going. We had a bunch of work from home orders. The studio took a massive hit to their development staff, and realistically, the studio was in grave danger regardless of what they announced. They got greenlit for the next expansion, which is okay because Icebrood Saga was mediocre at best. If they had another year or so of development time on it, it could have been something really good, but they finally hit the emergency button and said, we're releasing Cantha, and actually started advertising the game. Up until this point, ArenaNet had like no advertising budget, no team or anything. They did some like bogus Quiznos giveaways or something. They had like 1 trailer. It was like their entire marketing department were like, oh yeah, I love Quiznos. Meanwhile, there's only like 2 in existence. They finally figured out what targeted advertising was on social media, figured out what Twitch drops were, what Prime Gaming was, and finally started to market End of Dragons. They wrapped up IBS with the fastest solution of any Living World expansion ever. Just break the bars, kill the pylons, and congrats, you beat 2 dragons. The Icebrood Saga was lame because it was stretched out from Q4 of 2019 to April April of 2021. During this time, we also got the Legendary Armory, which spit in the face of the ultra hardcore players, but ultimately is one of the best features in the game and gave a lot of quality of life to Legendary Armor. I'm very happy with the Legendary Armory, and it makes gearing up your account and gearing up your characters really awesome. There was a content drought essentially from August of 2021 to February of 2022 with the launch of End of Dragons. There was some content with the Season of the Dragons or the Return to achievements, which are still a valuable way to get caught up to get the Legendary Amulet for your account, along with a lot of currency for things like the Sky Scale. The Mystery Dragon that we were going to be encountering in End of Dragons, we knew nothing about at this point. Everyone guessed that there was going to be a water dragon that caused the Karka event from the Lost Shores back in 2012. However, we did not get that. We got your friendly dragon turned enemy in End of Dragons. End of Dragons was released in February of 2022, and while in Cantha, it didn't really have the same feel as Guildwars 1 Cantha, and many of the maps felt desolate, with Caning City being confusing and frustrating to navigate without proper mounts. The storyline was okay, the writing was okay, but the new Imperial favor system and complicated way of converting materials to make profit off of the various metas left a lot of players feeling confused. The biggest blunder was the marketing around the Siege Turtle. All of the ads were focused about the Siege Turtle, when you had to get a turtle egg from a highly coordinated, buggy, and difficult meta event, and a complete coordinated instance group of content for the other components, in the form of the Kyning Overlook Strike mission. While players familiar with the game and familiar with raiding or strikes up to this point had no problems meeting the requirements, there were large amounts of community backlash over both the requirement of the End of Dragons meta success and the Kyning Overlook Strike mission. The elite specializations were good, however they weren't really as good as Path of Fire or Heart of Thorns, not in terms of strength, but in terms of identity, fun, and purity of purpose. Most of these classes felt like they were subpar compared to Firebrand, compared to Scourge, compared to Druid, and the previous elite specializations. Firebrand was nerfed, Mechanist was overpowered, and behind the scenes there were developer messages that were leaked indicating that they were balancing based on preference instead of actual numbers and balance, which led to quite a bit of shakeup and rebalancing of a lot of classes during this time. For the entirety of the post-patch content, there was no Living World Season 5. They ended up re-releasing Season 1 in a pseudo-repeatable introduction to give players an idea of the story and a proper introduction to our band of dragon fighters that we would go through all of these expansions with. This content re-release took place from April of 2022 to February of 2023. So unless you were interested in Season 1, you were largely experiencing yet another content drought after a rather disappointing expansion. The only good repeatable content that came out of the Living World Season 1 revamp was Old Lion's Court, which the difficulty plus the challenge mode seemed to be a good sweet spot for most hardcore players. However, this strike is now often neglected by the community. Following the re-release of Season 1, Gaella Delve was introduced as what the community thought to be the post-expansion content. Typically speaking, we would get an expansion like POF with the entire Living World season that was 5 new maps, new story episodes, and so on. After the big flub that was the Icebrood Saga, the community expected a reversion to the previous release cadence that was Season 3 and Season 4. The first half of Gaella Delve was okay. There were some annoying mechanics like the air purifier and the final boss being a giant hellspawn, but there were high hopes for the second release. Aptly called the tunnel because that's all it was. Additionally, it required turtle mechanics to complete the event, with the turtle being rather bulky and hard to control, and combine this with a lot of collisions in a tight space in order to make yet another interesting health sponge final boss, which led the entire player base to wonder what was going on and if this was going to be the living world that we expect. Surprise, surprise, it is not the living world we expect, and the studio announces a new expansion cadence. This pretty much brings us up to present day, Following the disappointing release of the Gaella Delve, which is now an abandoned map, the studio announced a new expansion model, essentially cutting some of what was actually released with the expansions, like elite specializations, although there hasn't been complete confirmation that it's gone for good. They stated that they will be implementing equivalent content for players that we could interface with, and it led to the now fifth revision of their model in the last decade. This is the most recent expansion, and instead of it being a standalone story, much like Heart of Thorns and POF, it has been trickle-fed to the community through quarterly updates, with the main draw being legendary armor that can be acquired through open-world PvE gameplay. This was previously locked behind raids, structured PvP, or world vs. world, and the addition of relics, which take place of these special effects that were previously tied to runes. This led to a community backlash as players were losing functionality of the legendary runes that were implemented in the game much earlier. And at the time of making this video, the legendary relic has yet to be implemented. It should be implemented soon. They also decided to implement Weapon Master training, which opened up all of the available weapons that were once tied behind elite specializations to all the other classes. And this led to a slew of initial balance problems, but they've largely been corrected. The problem with this model is that it feels kind of like an early access to content that isn't entirely completed. Soto introduced a large amount of currencies and items that essentially have no use, and the player base can collect it to an unknown degree before the implementation of the legendary items in the future. Once the content is completely released, which will be in time for their next expansion announcement at the launch of Q4 of 2024, we will have a better feel at how much the players actually get from this new expansion model. Largely, I feel at a $25 price tag, it is still a good deal, and the story content is interesting and fun to play. However, a large number of players that played the new content and immediately went back to End of Dragons or Heart of Thorns or their own established gameplay loops. Another thing that was added was the Wizard's Vault. The Wizard's Vault was introduced as part of Soto, which was a revamp to the daily rewards system, as I mentioned earlier. They introduced a large number of high-value items and have been very generous with the currency in the Wizard's Vault, letting even casual players who play only an hour a day be able to complete these achievements easily. There are some questionable items in there that could be removed in the future. However, for the most part, the Wizard's Vault is a great addition, and it is a good way to gear up your account. As I share my final thoughts, the answer from minute one would have obviously been yes, you should play Guild Wars 2. This game is definitely worth playing, and even more so if you are a time-limited player, a casual player, or someone who just wants to experience a good story. The writing has consistently increased in quality, with more willingness to take on darker, more intriguing story beats, with characters that are more ambiguously good or evil. ArenaNet has shown some level of fairness with their implementation of these new models and reworks to old systems. Furthermore, the game is very much alive. With 2 trickle-fed expansions already confirmed, we still have almost a year left of Secrets of the Obscure, and all of the older expansions, raids, strikes, and fractals are still valuable and played regularly. The bundles for the entire collection go on sale regularly, and the new expansions are fairly priced for what you get. As someone who has been playing this franchise since Guild Wars 1 Prophecies, I can tell you that it has been a fun journey without FOMO or monetary strain of a monthly subscription, and being able to take breaks as life demands. The criticisms I've had about the various content releases don't really reflect their value in present day, and the entire story being released makes the play style a lot different. The IBS releases felt largely like a content drought, even though now the maps, metas, strikes are all part of many players' daily gameplay routine. Something I feel will be the same for Soto once it's completed. My outlook on the game is good, and I look forward to continuing to play well into the future. So if you've made it this far, I would like to thank you so much for watching. And if you liked the video, please drop a like. And if you want to see more videos on Guild Wars 2, please consider subscribing. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.